Martin Luther stands in the annals of Western, global, and religious history as a giant with few companions. In the world of disciples, he certainly ranks alongside St. Paul as the most influential disciple or follower of a religious founder. Luther also doesn't stand far beneath the likes of those religious founders, Jesus, Muhammad, and Buddha, as among the most influential religious figures who ever lived. But what, exactly, is Luther's real revolution or Reformation? Luther's name is synonymous with the Protestant Reformation. We are all familiar with the half-truths and lies that accompany that story. Luther was a devout Christian monk who grew aghast with the abuses of the late Renaissance Catholic Church, hierarchy, and papacy. He took a stand, the story goes, for anti-corruption, the people, and personal piety, nailing his 95 Theses on the Wittenberg Cathedral. The obtuse Catholic Church refused to heed Luther's call for cleaning house. Luther, therefore, and possibly with the protection of the Holy Spirit, pending your theological commitments, broke away to start Christianity anew, inaugurating an age of anti-corruption, personal piety, and pro-biblicist Christianity unseen since the apostolic age. Or at least that's how the story is often told. We are not here to discuss the merits of the pro-Reformation story. We are here to discuss the forgotten revolution Luther unleashed, one with significant consequences for the development of human consciousness, philosophy, science, and history through to the modern age. Luther's stand against ecclesiastical abuse and privilege, noble as it may have been, isn't the real revolution Luther began. Luther's real revolution was how we, as humans, related to the world and understood ourselves in the world. Luther's real revolution brought forth a significant change in human consciousness and our understanding and relationship to the world we inhabit. Prior to the Reformation, the long tradition of Greek philosophy and Catholic theology had been synthesized through anagogic consciousness. Following from Plato, but especially Aristotle, the Western intellectual tradition, from the Greeks to Catholicism, understood the world in a layered, hierarchical manner. There were multiple levels of existence, thus the anagogic consciousness of our minds, the most common dichotomy being between the material and the spiritual, or the ideal. These multiple levels of existence were synthetic to each other, rather than in opposition to one another, an idea derived from Plato and expanded upon by Aristotle and Plotinus. There were, therefore, multiple causes of existence, per Aristotle, who gave the most famous example of this reality: the material, the formal, the efficient, and the final. Humanity's place in the world was to peel back the veil of existence, to push beyond the material, to find what lay beyond the mere objective, and enter and dwell in the totality of existence. The anagogic way of understanding the world was highly contemplative. It was based on understanding our place in the world. It privileged thought over action, though it did not shun the importance of activity in the world. Luther's battering ram against the Church was not so much directed against the Church as the anti-Catholic polemical story suggests. Rather, Luther spent more time hammering Aristotle and Greek science more than Catholic abuses and theology. We must recall, even in the 95 Theses, Luther actually accepted the validity of indulgences and other practices that we mistakenly claim today he opposed. But why did Luther assail Aristotle so much? Why did he call reason a whore? Luther's assault on Aristotle and Greek science had to do with his attack on the anagogic consciousness of Catholicism. For Luther, the layered, multiple existent cosmos was a fraud, an invention of the Greeks which had tainted Christianity. The goal of the Christian life wasn't to contemplate the many layers of existence through the many layers of Christian scriptural interpretation, for instance, the fourfold exegetical principles begun in the patristic era and solidified in the scholastic. The goal of the Christian life was understanding one's place in the unfolding of history, the movement of divine providence from Alpha to Omega, beginning to end. Luther was not the first to attempt to find our place in the world in accord with the movement of history. One can make a plausible argument that this tradition is very much found in the scriptures, found in the various authentic epistles of Paul, as well as the Johannine writings. Other churchmen and theologians through the eras had also taken such approaches. However, Luther was the first to gloriously plant his foot in the ground, take his stand, and unleash the historicist mode of thinking that now dominates modern consciousness. When we speak of the movement of history, the arc of history, the meaning of history, the progress of history, the right side of history, that history will judge us, we are all the unwitting heirs of Luther's revolution. The most educated, of course, which means not the likes of most people on the internet, or say the new atheist movement, know this. That means, however, few people know the great debt that modern consciousness has to Luther. Most of us think that the idea of history or the movement of history is a novel, modern concept. In fact, it finds its roots in Luther and the post-Lutheran theologians. According to Luther, Christian contemplation over the anagogic reality of the world endangers one's spiritual commitments to Christ and his prophetic second coming, the final stage of world history and its consummate completion. Our contemplation leading to action shouldn't be about figuring out the hierarchy of angels. Luther, of course, accepts the reality of angels, but places not so great a stock in their significance because debating the hierarchy of angels is only a concern for the anagogically minded. It should be about understanding where we stand in the movement and the unfolding of history to its completion. Luther, therefore, more so than Augustine and other precursors like Cyprian and Lactantius, does much more in advancing the idea of a linear, or at least, and perhaps more accurately, a teleological conception of history. Before Luther, teleology was contained to man and the cosmos. This is what Greek and Catholic philosophy and theology concerned itself with. With Luther, teleology shifts away from man and the cosmos to the idea of history. History has the primary telos in Luther. Man is just caught up in that teleological movement. Anyone who is intimately familiar with the philosophy of history offered to us by Hegel can see Hegel's great debt to Luther. Thus, free will, the prized theological commitment of post-Hellenic Catholicism, is subsequently lost. If man has a telos, as Catholicism says, man is also partly responsible for actualizing his nature, his purpose in life. In Luther, history's telos overrides man's purpose. We are just along for the ride of history. The teleological conception of history that Luther entrenches becomes foundational to the development of German philosophy, especially in the names of men like Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and especially Hegel. Even decidedly anti-theological philosophers like Nietzsche still carry the residue of Luther in them, as do political writers and philosophers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and economic historicists like Edward Bernstein. The dialectic of history and the idea of scientific history and economic history offered to us by the likes of Hegel, Marx, and Bernstein are all but secularizations of Luther's historical consciousness, his idea of history with the telos. As is, of course, the teleological conception of science offered to us in Darwin's theory of evolution. The purpose of evolution and the movement of evolutionary science to higher forms of consciousness, even sans the divine, echo with the boisterous thunderclaps of Luther's pulpit preaching. The real revolution that Luther begat to the world is the historical imagination, a historical consciousness. Those of us, almost all of us, who contemplate in a relationship to history, the progress of science, or the evolution of consciousness, owe a great debt to Luther. Rather than contemplate about our place and purpose in the broader cosmos, the purpose of our nature in relationship to the rest of nature, Luther's revolution detaches us from nature and directs our consciousness to the concept of history, which has, in time, become devoid of the theological and become the concept of politics, the concept of economics, the concept of progress, the idea of scientific progress and evolution, etc. Yet, all of these so-called modern ideas owe their lineage to Martin Luther. In this way, Luther's Reformation has been far more successful and influential than the spread of a new religion. Almost all of us moderns, especially those of us living in Western countries, whether religious or irreligious, Protestant or not, are all disciples of Luther. History and its meaning, rather than human nature, became the focus of Luther's thought and is undeniably a hallmark of modern consciousness and modernity. More than 500 years later, we are still wrestling with history and its meaning, just as Luther did.